Hi, everyone, and welcome to this edition of the Locker Room Chat brought to you by the Shanneman Sports Museum of Tacoma Pierce County and Rainier Asphalt and Concrete, the #1 asphalt and concrete repair contractor in the Tacoma and Seattle areas. For quality workmanship and top-notch customer service, contact Rainier Asphalt and Concrete at www.rainierasphalt.com. Let them know they heard about them on the Locker Room Chat. I'm Steve Thomas, your host today, and we're really excited to have a Washington State Hall of Fame trainer and a gentleman who's been around the Tacoma area for many, many years as the athletic trainer at Pacific Lutheran University. Gary Nicholson is our guest today. And Gary, we've got a lot of ground to cover. First of all, I guess the first question for you would be, how does a guy who is a native of Idaho and a guy who went to the College of Idaho, how does he end up with the Chicago Cubs and eventually with the Seattle Mariners?
Well, thank you, Steve. I started out at the College of Idaho just as a normal student. I was originally majoring in pre-law and decided that that wasn't my niche there. Got into athletic training through being asked to be the trainer for the college. They didn't have anybody, and I had an interest in, again, a little bit in medicine, and went through my 4.5 years there at the College of Idaho. And during that length of time, got a job in the summers with the Treasure Valley Cubs or the Caldwell Cubs, depending upon which years that you were looking at. And had a person there by the name of Pat O'Connor, who was the stadium manager, kind of a person of all trades. And he recommended to the Cubs that I would be a good person to be their athletic trainer. From there, I went back to Indiana University and got my master's. And it was interesting at Indiana that that was the time when they went to the Rose Bowl. And I also was able to work with Dr. Councilman, who was the swimming coach. And he had, I think at that particular time, had been the swimming coach for the Olympics, at least I think 4 sessions. So that was a really great experience. Leaving there, I went on to AAA, and that was here in Tacoma, which is unusual to jump from as a trainer for the rookie team all the way up to AAA. But at that time, the Cubs didn't have a trainer at single A or double A, so they didn't have anybody to move up. And so I worked with the Tacoma Cubs, and I would go to spring training and be with the major league team for 3 weeks, and then go with the Tacoma Cubs for 2 weeks, and then come up here to Tacoma. And then after the season was up here, then I'd go back down to Arizona for instructional league. So it's kind of year round.
Yeah. Hey, Gary, I want to touch base on a couple of things you mentioned. First of all, at C of I know you were an athlete there. Was there something in particular that kind of turned you from, being a basketball player to getting into sports training in particular?
Well, it was interesting that my freshman year I played, and the coach told me that they were bringing a new player in, and that I would be being moved to forward. Well, I couldn't dribble as I was more of a center, being about 6'4.5". I mean, it made pretty good. Well, the person they brought in was a person by the name of Taft Jackson, and he was 6'8", a player out of Oakland, California, and he averaged, while he was there, 33 points a game.
Oh my, yeah.
And so, there's no way I could have competed that way. And so I just decided that since you can't dribble, you need to find something else and so forth.
When you went on to graduate studies after C of I and then on to Indiana, you mentioned Doc Councilman, who's one of the legendary swim coaches of all time, maybe the most famous college swim coach ever in the United States. But he had a young protege at that time who went on to become one of the legendary swimmers of all time, too.
Yeah, you're talking about Mark Spitz,
Yes.
and he was there just as I was leaving there, and he was unbelievable. I remember that he was there kind of like in the spring, and people they just talked about him and so forth, and that was just the thing. And in fact, swimming at that time, they would pack the swimming pool just to come and watch. And councilman and knew how to teach and how to motivate him.
When you got into sports training, sports medicine, you went, as you mentioned, to Boise and then to Tacoma, here in Tacoma with the Tacoma Cubs. And I know that was your first stop, but really with the Cubs organization.
Yes. Well, I started in Caldwell with your organization.
Okay. Yeah.
And then that would be like with, the Mariners have got the Aqua Sox, and that would be the equivalent to them at that time. And we had some great ball players coming out of Caldwell. Had Ken Holtzman came out of there, Bert Hooton, and Bill Stone, and some of those players and so forth. So we had some great there. And so, and those players came on up to Tacoma to play. And so it was kind of like a carry-on. And so I left, when I say I left the Tacoma Cubs, because they moved on to Wichita, Kansas. And I found out when we were winter ball, one night, Laura, my wife, and I was watching the news, and they announced that they were moving their team to Wichita, and I didn't have any idea that was happening. And we looked at each other and we said, "Oh, we're not going there." And so I told them I wasn't going, and so was not. I had 2 weeks where I was not working for them, and then they invited me to go to Chicago as the first year as an assistant, and then after that was the head trainer.
Yeah. Now, this Bulgaria, this is in the 70s, I guess, when you eventually made the move to Chicago, but kind of in the, for the most part, in the early years of sports medicine and sports training. Tell us about how it was. You're a guy that's in your 20s at that point, and all of a sudden you're in, you've made the move up through Caldwell and through Tacoma. And, still pretty much in your 20s, all of a sudden you're an assistant trainer with the Chicago Cubs of Major League Baseball.
There was a lot of older trainers and so forth that was in baseball, and a lot of them didn't have education. Mm-hmm. Some of them might have had a degree in physical education, but not athletic training, and they got their experience there. What's interesting, the trainer that was at Chicago when I was there, he had been a trainer in Minneapolis, St. Paul. He and another trainer by the name of Bill Bueller for the ended up being with the Dodgers. You had Minneapolis and you had St. Paul having AAA trainers. And so happened that there was 2 job openings. One was in Chicago and one was in Los Angeles, and they were both friends, and they decided, well, I'm going to apply for one, and the other guy was going to apply for the other one. They kind of flipped a coin to see who got which, and Al Schuneman went to Chicago thinking that the Cubs hadn't won for a long time, and so he had a great chance. And Bueller went to Los Angeles, and you know the story there. Los Angeles went on and won several World Series and so forth. Mm-hmm. So that's the kind of, and you worked your way up at that time. Nowadays, you can move from one club to another because the general manager or the manager wants you. And so your experience in the minor leagues is helpful to get a job, but right now it's more who you know.
Tell me about those days, in Chicago, Gary. You're there and not really getting your feet wet because you have some experience behind you, but being around a Major League Baseball club, and we're talking the Chicago Cubs. Now, when you were there, this was the 70s, so there were a lot of familiar faces, and I'm sure baseball fans who go back to that era know about guys like Ron Santo and Ernie Banks and Billy Williams, Ferguson Jenkins, all these guys, and the legendary Leo DeRocher was your skipper.
Right. I had the advantage of going, when I was in Tacoma, of going to spring training and being that 3 weeks or so with the Major League club. So I knew the players really well. And when I went up as an assistant and then went from there on, it was easy because they knew me and I knew them. And there wasn't this having to learn everything, at the last minute. All those players, that you mentioned were really interesting players. Leo, as a manager, if you got to go back and look a little bit different with Leo. Leo came in from managing other places, and the Cubs were having this, what they called a college of coaches running things. And you had Mr. Wrigley decided to go and try something new. Instead of having a manager, he had a head coach. And so what they had was they had about 5 coaches, and one coach, the pitching coach, was a particular person that, when I explain a little bit more, he didn't move, but the other coaches, they would rotate. And you would have maybe, there was, Edwin Tappy, and he was a catching coach, but he might be the head coach for this week. And then if things were going well, then he might be able to survive for the next week. Or if he didn't, well, then they switched and brought in another one. Another one would be like Lou Klein, and so they rotated these coaches. Well, you can imagine that didn't work very well.
No.
So Mr. Wrigley decided, well, that didn't work well, so he brought in Leo. And Leo's first comment was, and so forth, that nice players don't win, and so he was going to change things. Well, the first year that he was there, this is back in the 60s, late 60s, they didn't win the first year. They ended up in last place.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but Leo was an interesting guy. He was, if everything was going right, the players loved him. And if everything wasn't going right, well, they didn't like him. And much more so than right now. But he was very superstitious. You have to realize that he had, the tradition in Chicago before that was the old, the billy goat that
yes,
wasn't allowed in the stadium. And so because of that, the Cubs had a hex put on them, and they didn't win. And I remember being there, that we were sitting in the dugout one day, and all of us, and during warm-ups before the game started, and hear a black cat walked across the infield. And Leo made the comment, well, that does it for the year. We might as well close up and go home.
Oh my, yeah.
And so, and he was superstitious in the sense that the infield ball, after going around the players throwing the ball around the infield, and then they would then the game would start, or the next inning would start, when the first baseman would throw, or the second baseman would throw the ball into the dugout. Well, I picked the ball up, and I got chewed out because Leo says, my trainer does not touch the baseball.
Oh boy, yeah.
And so he was just superstitious like that. But again,
Yeah, and he had that famous quote too, the nice guys finish last. Was he one of those guys that kind of, rode guys a little bit and tried to get them, inspire them in some way, even if it was a negative way?
Well, he could chew you out real good.
Yeah.
And he did that. He and if you he kept Sano, Beckert, Kessinger, that group. He wasn't a real good fan of Ernie's, and I think because Ernie had all the he was just liked by everybody. The fans liked him, and he got the press was always around Ernie and so forth, and wasn't around Leo. So Leo didn't like that type of accolades that he got.
Yeah, it was Ernie always projected that image of being kind of a positive light and a very, very guy who was always congenial. And was he that type of person?
Yes, he was. His favorite phrase was "Let's play two," and he made that comment one time. "Let's play two," and they were playing down in Houston, and this is in the days before the Dome down there. And they played a doubleheader, and he didn't make all the second game. The heat got to him. He had to go out. But no, I mean, I can remember, and this was back when I was in AAA, and we were down in the instructional league, and Ernie came down to help coach after the season up in Chicago. And Ernie says, "You work so hard, you've done so much for me." He says, "You've got to come over to my place and have steak and salad and everything else." So so I and my wife and our two kids went over to see to be with Ernie. And he didn't have to do that. You didn't see the major league teams.
Yeah, great guy.
Right.
One guy I know a lot of people in this area are familiar with, and someone who finally got his deserved accolades here just a couple of years ago, and that's Seattle native Ron Santo, who had some issues later in life with diabetes and so forth, but finally got some recognition for his career. And I know a lot of people in this area are familiar with Ron. Yeah,
Ron was a person that was a leader. He was more like he was the captain of the ball club, and he would be a person and so forth that he would come off the bench. I mean, he'd come off the field and come to the bench between innings, and if you weren't doing things right out there, he would tell you. But in a nice way, but a very, very forceful way. And he was he didn't want people to know about his diabetes, and we were one of the first clubs that used Gatorade.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Because Gatorade at that particular time didn't have any sugar in it. It had they sweetened it with saccharin, and the rest of the ball players would have glasses of Coke on the bench and so forth that they could drink from, and we had that and water, and so I would use Gatorade down when I was in Indiana, and so I thought, well, if you can't have the other, we use that and so forth, which helped him. And again, and we'd go on the road and so forth with his diabetes situation, and I get a phone call at night, and he'd say, "Gary, I can't remember whether I took a shot or not." He would give himself shots.
Okay.
And I said, "Well, look in your trash can. Is there a needle in the trash can and so forth?" And at that time, a needle in the trash can was different than a needle in the trash can now. But he would look and so forth. And he was also the person that, when I was first back there, the Cubs had a basketball team. And they would go around to high school, and they would play the coaches of the high schools and faculty and so forth. And that's the way the high schools could make money. And the players got paid money for doing that. And I got paid for going along with them. And he came to me the first year and he said, Gary, he says, you're going to be back here this winter? And I said, yes. And he said, well, we want you to go and be with us and take care of us and so forth. So again,
yeah, that's kind of a trainer's nightmare, right, Gary? Being with a traveling basketball team of baseball players, you cringe anytime anybody falls down or turns an ankle or whatever.
Well, that was my first year for that was the last year because Mr. Wrigley said no more. He was afraid with that and so forth. But we had some pretty good basketball players. We had Fergie Jenkins had played with the Globetrotters.
Oh, wow.
And Kessinger had played in college. Beckert had played in college. Paul Popovich had been, he played in college. So we had some pretty good guys.
Gary, for you, now you were there in the early 70s. I'm sure people are curious who would follow the Cubs in the late 60s. And of course that, the meltdown of, I believe it was the 69 season. Was there still kind of a carryover of, trying to come back from that and live down the fact that they, blown a big lead late in the season and had missed out on a chance to get to a World Series, and it had been so long, as you mentioned, for the Cubs since they had been to one before that. Was there still kind of was that lingering over the franchise a little bit in those early 70s years?
Yes, in fact, in 72 and in 73, we were in either first or second place up through the All-Star break. And I think in 73, we were even farther, closer to August by being first or second. And because I can remember, I think it was 72 that I remember the players voting upon, they had to vote on shares.
Okay,
for playoffs. And you vote like in August and so forth, but it didn't happen.
Now for you, Gary, other guys you mentioned, Ferguson Jenkins, Billy Williams, these were, they were outstanding players that who ended up having great careers in Chicago, but as you mentioned, they never got that ring, but I'm sure they were just superstars in that city.
Oh, Chicago, and it still is I think one of the best places for baseball. The fans are unbelievable. Opening day in Chicago, kids become sick at school so they can go to the ball game. The stadium is packed, and you'll hear people talk about how they would have their radios on and so forth, and like in school and in businesses and everything else. And I'd hear people talk about they'd walk into stores and the radio would be on for the Cubs. It was just unbelievable. And as I say, it was something that I'd never had experienced before that.
And for fans of the Cubs, of course, in those years, it was all day games. I believe it. I don't think they switched until, I'm trying to think, was that later in the 80s that they switched over to having night baseball, right?
Right. And the other thing was an advantage for the Cubs, and so were, like you say, the day games, was also the fact that the Cubs were, in the Eastern Division, and the travel was so short for everything. It was like an airplane fare. Not fair, but an airplane trip to St. Louis was 45 minutes. Cincinnati was the same way. Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, even New York was a short one. And the fans could go. You'd go to one of these other cities, and we would have to go a lot of times and have a dining room set up for us to eat in because we couldn't eat in the local hotel or around because the fans were there wanting autographs or just wanted to talk to them and so forth. So that was another thing that was really different. people would go and talk about, they would take their vacation. Let's say you had a week vacation. They would plan it around where the Cubs would be playing, and they would go.
Oh, yeah.
Or they would plan it around, and they would go every day to the ballpark in Chicago.
Hey, Gary, in our next segment, which we're going to get to here in a minute, we're going to talk a little bit about your transition. But final question for this segment was, what was your decision personally as you spent several years with the Chicago Cubs and eventually became the first ever trainer for the new Seattle Mariners franchise? What was it that spurred you to make that choice?
There was two reasons. One was that one, I wanted to get back to the Northwest because I have family out in this area. I was also at that time, okay, my salary wasn't large enough for, I wasn't paid year round.
Okay.
So I had to have another job. Well, the first year I was back in Chicago and I worked at a YMCA. And then I got then the next year, the year after that, I had talked to the College of Idaho about working for them in the off season. And we have an agreement and everything else. And I got a phone call in the spring of '73 from Jim Kittlesby, who was the sports information director at POU. And he said, Gary, would you be interested in coming to POU and being our trainer for football and basketball in the off season? And I said, oh, I already have one with the College of Idaho. Well, I talked to the College of Idaho then, and the athletic director there was also the basketball coach, Dick Carroll. And he said, Gary, all of the contracts was in my car, in my garage, and we had a fire last night. And so the contracts got burned up. He says, so you do not have a contract. I've got a verbal one, but I don't. He says I don't have a written anything. So if you want to go someplace else, you're more than happy. So I talked to the assistant athletic director, who had been my mentor back there, and College of Idaho, and he said, Gary, I'd go to Seattle. I'd go to. He said, no, I would not Seattle. I would go to POU. And he said, we're hurting for money, and we're going to be cutting teams pretty soon.
Okay. Yeah.
4 years later, they cut all their sports except basketball, tennis, and skiing, and they had the same amount of sports as POU did. So I talked to Jim, and so I came to POU.
That's an amazing transition. And we're going to talk more about that and also about your move to the Seattle Mariners in our next segment. This concludes part one of our interview, but I invite you to please join us the next time to hear more from Gary Nicholson. On behalf of Rainier Asphalt and Concrete and the Shannon Sports Museum of Tacoma Pierce County, I'm Steve Thomas. We thank you for joining us on another edition of the Locker Room Chat.